The dust hung heavy in the air as Xavier Cole rode into the small town of Sweetwater Creek, his weathered hat pulled low over his eyes, shadowing a face that had seen too many miles and not enough kindness. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new life after the Civil War had faded like morning mist under the harsh western sun. All he had to his name was his faithful paint horse, a Colt revolver with 3 bullets, and memories he'd rather forget. The main street was quiet as Xavier guided his mount past the general store, saloon, and a small white church whose paint was peeling under the relentless Texas sun. His keen eyes took in every detail, the way people glanced at him, then quickly away, the whispered conversations that died as he passed. Sweetwater Creek was like 100 other frontier towns he drifted through, except for one thing. This one held the promise of work at the Garner Ranch outside town, and Xavier was down to his last dollar. He tethered his horse outside the saloon, patting the animal's neck before entering the establishment. "Just a few days here, old friend," he murmured. "Then we'll move on, we always do." The saloon's interior was dim after the bright sunlight, smelling of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. A few early patrons glanced his way, taking in his lean frame, the worn but well-kept saddle gear, the revolver holstered at his hip. Xavier moved to the bar with the easy, measured stride of a man accustomed to being watched. "Whiskey?" he said to the barkeep, placing his coin on the rough wooden surface. The barkeep, a burly man with one milky eye, nodded and poured the drink. "Passing through?" he asked, the usual question for strangers. "Looking for work," Xavier replied, keeping his voice low. "Heard Garner might be hiring." The barkeep's good eye narrowed. "Garner, huh? You've got timing, stranger. His foreman was in earlier saying they lost 2 men to some trouble with rustlers." He leaned closer. "But Garner's a hard man. Not everyone lasts out there." Xavier downed his whiskey in one swallow, feeling the familiar burn. "I've worked for hard men before. I bet you have." The barkeep refilled his glass without being asked. "This one's on the house. Name's Tom, Xavier Cole." "Well, Mr. Cole, if it's the Garner spread you're heading to, you might want to know that his daughter's running most of it these days. Meredith Garner. Old man had a stroke last year, can barely sit a horse anymore. She's the one really calling the shots, though some don't take kindly to taking orders from a woman." Xavier merely nodded, filing away the information. He wasn't one to judge who gave the orders, as long as the pay was fair and on time. The saloon doors swung open, letting in a shaft of sunlight and the silhouette of a woman. As she stepped inside, conversations halted. She moved with purpose, her riding skirt swishing against polished boots. Auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her face, though smudged with trail dust, held a determined beauty that even the hardest men in the room seemed to respect. Tom straightened. "Miss Garner," he acknowledged. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." Meredith Garner's eyes scanned the room before settling on Xavier. There was something assessing in her gaze, as though she were tallying his worth the way she might a steer at auction. "Tom," she nodded to the barkeep. "I'm looking for hands. Lost 2 good men yesterday." Her voice was clear and confident, without the affected gentility of Eastern ladies Xavier had encountered. "This here's Xavier Cole," Tom said, gesturing. "Just mentioned he's looking for work." Meredith's eyes remained on Xavier. "Can you ride, Mr. Cole? Handle a gun?" "Keep your head when others are losing theirs." "Yes to all 3, Miss Garner," Xavier replied, meeting her gaze directly. "And can you take orders from a woman?" A hint of a smile touched Xavier's lips. "I can take orders from anyone who knows what they're doing." Something flickered in her eyes, amusement, perhaps, or appreciation for his directness. "We pay $20 a month plus room and board. Work starts at dawn, often ends after dusk. Sundays are your own unless there's trouble." "Fair enough. We've had rustlers hitting the north pasture." 2 men dead. I need someone who won't run at the first sign of trouble." Xavier set his empty glass down. "I don't run, Miss Garner." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Get your horse. We ride back to the ranch now. I'll want to see how you handle yourself before I decide." Without waiting for his response, she turned and exited the saloon. Xavier tossed a nod to Tom and followed her out into the bright sunlight. Meredith was already astride a magnificent chestnut mare, her posture straight as a cavalry officer's. She watched as Xavier mounted his paint horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "That's a fine animal," she commented, nodding to his horse. "Comanche," Xavier replied. "Been with me through hell and back." "Let's hope you don't find any more hell at the Garner ranch," she said, then turned her mare and set off at a brisk trot. Xavier followed, keeping pace easily. They rode in silence for the first mile, leaving the small town behind and entering the vast open country that spread like an ocean of grass to the distant mountains. It was beautiful country, Xavier had to admit, the kind of place a man might consider stopping if he ever tired of drifting. "Where are you from, Mr. Cole?" Meredith asked finally, breaking the silence. "Georgia originally," he answered. "Been moving west since the war ended. Fighting for the South?" "Yes," she nodded, accepting this without comment. "And since then," Xavier shrugged. "Worked ranches from Louisiana to Colorado, drove cattle up the goodnight-loving trail a few times, tracked bounties when ranch work was scarce." "A man of varied talents," she observed. "What brings you to Sweetwater Creek?" "Chance," he said honestly, "and the need for work." She studied him from beneath the brim of her hat. "Most men who come through here have something they're running from or something they're chasing after. Which is it for you, Mr. Cole?" Xavier met her gaze. "Maybe both, Miss Garner. Does it matter as long as I do the job?" A small smile touched her lips. "I suppose not, but I like to know the measure of men who work for me." "And how do you measure a man, if I might ask?" "By his word and his work," she replied without hesitation. "The rest is his own business." They fell into silence again as the trail wound through a shallow creek and up a gentle rise. From the top, Xavier could see the Garner ranch spread out below a substantial main house, bunkhouse, stables, and corrals, all nestled in a protected valley with hills rising beyond. Cattle dotted the pastures, and in the distance, he could make out riders moving along the perimeter. "It's a fine spread," he commented. "My father built it from nothing," Meredith said, pride evident in her voice. "Came here 25 years ago with just a wagon and a dream. Now we run 2,000 head of cattle on 30,000 acres." She paused. "And I intend to keep it that way, despite those who think a woman can't manage such things." Xavier nodded. "I've known several women who could outwork, outride, and outthink most men I've met." She gave him a sidelong glance. "Is that meant to flatter me, Mr. Cole?" "Just stating facts, Miss Garner." As they approached the ranch, a man rode out to meet them, a weathered cowhand in his 50s with a silver-streaked beard and suspicious eyes. "Foreman," Meredith explained quietly. "Sam Wilkins. Been with my father since the beginning, loyal to the bone but old-fashioned in his thinking." Wilkins reined in beside them, his gaze fixed on Xavier. "Found yourself a new hand, Miss Meredith?" "Perhaps," she replied. "This is Xavier Cole, Mr. Cole. This is Sam Wilkins, our foreman." Xavier nodded in greeting. "Mr. Wilkins." The foreman's eyes narrowed. "Where'd you ride in from?" "North," Xavier answered simply. "Man of few words," Wilkins commented, looking to Meredith. "You sure about this one, miss?" "We don't know anything about him." "I'm sure enough to give him a chance," she replied firmly. "Mr. Cole will bunk with the other hands. Tomorrow, take him on the North Perimeter ride. I want to see if he spots what Davidson and Miller missed." Wilkins clearly wanted to argue but knew better. "Yes, madam." He turned his horse and led the way to the ranch buildings. "Don't mind Sam," Meredith said as they followed. "He's protective. After losing 2 men to rustlers, he's even more cautious than usual." "Understandable," Xavier replied. "Good foremen protect their people." They dismounted at the stables, where a young stable boy rushed out to take the horses. Xavier retrieved his bedroll and saddle bags, the sum total of his possessions. "Dinner's at 6 in the cookhouse," Meredith informed him, removing her gloves. "Breakfast at 5. "Sam will show you to the bunkhouse." Xavier nodded. "Thank you for the opportunity, Miss Garner." Something in his tone made her pause and study him more carefully. "We all need opportunities, Mr. Cole. I just hope you make the most of yours." With that, she turned and walked toward the main house, her back straight, her stride purposeful. Xavier watched her go, aware that Wilkins was watching him watch her. "Miss Meredith isn't like most women you've met," the foreman said, his voice low. "She's fair but tough as rawhide." Her father taught her everything he knows about ranching, and she's added plenty of her own wisdom besides. I can see that, Xavier replied. What you should also see is that she's off limits to the likes of hired hands, Wilkins added, his tone hardening. Her father may be ailing, but he still has plans for her future, and they don't include some drifter cowboy. Xavier met the foreman's stern gaze. I'm here to work, Mr. Wilkins, nothing more. The older man snorted. That's what they all say at first. He jerked his head toward a long, low building. Bunkhouse is there. Find yourself an empty bunk. Tools are in the shed behind it if you need to mend anything. Xavier nodded and headed toward the bunkhouse, feeling the foreman's eyes on his back. Inside, the building was simple but well-maintained: 2 rows of bunks, a pot-bellied stove in the center, a rough table with benches, and hooks on the walls for personal items. 3 men were inside, playing cards at the table. They looked up as Xavier entered. New blood, one commented, a stocky man with a handlebar mustache. I'm Hank. This here's Pete and Charlie. Xavier nodded to each. Xavier Cole. Take any empty bunk, Pete offered, a lanky man with a scar running down one cheek. Most of the boys are still out on the range. They'll be rolling in soon enough. Xavier chose a bunk near the door, an old habit from too many years of needing quick exits. He set down his gear and began organizing his sparse belongings. Charlie, a broad-shouldered man with an easy smile, spoke up. You heard about Davidson and Miller. Miss Garner mentioned losing men to rustlers, Xavier replied, checking the condition of his spare shirt. Weren't just rustlers, Hank said darkly. Word is they're working for Victor Blackwood. He owns the Double B Ranch to the north. Been trying to push Garner boundaries for years. More so since the old man took ill, Pete added. Figures with Henry Garner laid up and just a woman running things, the ranch is ripe for taking. Xavier considered this. Seems Miss Garner has other ideas. That she does, Charlie agreed with admiration in his voice. Never seen a woman with such grit. Rides as well as any man, can shoot straight, and knows ranching inside and out, but Blackwood's getting bolder. Those men who died weren't just stealing cattle, they left them with Garner brands cut clean off, throats slit. It was a message. Blackwood's a snake, Hank spat. Got money from somewhere back east, hired guns doing his dirty work. Xavier finished arranging his few possessions and sat on the edge of his bunk. How many hands does Garner have? 15, counting you, Pete answered. Good men, but most just cowboys, not gunfighters. Miss Meredith won't hire the kind of men Blackwood does, killers who enjoy their work too much. This information settled in Xavier's mind, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. A land dispute, an ailing patriarch, a daughter determined to hold what was hers, and a ruthless neighbor sensing weakness. It was a story as old as the frontier itself, and one that rarely ended well for those without the will or means to fight. The door opened and more men filed in, dusty from the day's work. Introductions were made, questions asked and answered. Xavier gave away little about himself, but observed much about the others. They were decent men, hard workers loyal to the Garner brand, but as Pete had said, not fighters by nature. At 6, the dinner bell rang and Xavier followed the others to the cookhouse. The meal was simple but hearty: beef stew, biscuits, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Meredith Garner didn't join them, taking her meals in the main house with her father, but Wilkins sat at the head of the long table, keeping a watchful eye on proceedings. After dinner, some men played cards, others mended equipment, and a few turned in early. Xavier cleaned his revolver, a ritual that centered him. As his hands moved through the familiar motions, he considered his situation. He hadn't planned to get involved in a range war, but $20 a month was good pay, and there was something about Meredith Garner's quiet determination that resonated with him. The next morning came early, the bunkhouse stirring to life before dawn. Xavier dressed quickly and joined the others for a breakfast of flapjacks, beans, and more of the eye-opening coffee. As promised, Wilkins assigned him to ride the north boundary, along with Hank and a quiet man named Joe who had barely spoken 2 words the previous evening. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the land. The north pasture was good grazing territory, with a creek running through it, providing year-round water. It was easy to see why Blackwood might covet it. "This is where we found Davidson," Hank said as they reached a stand of cottonwoods near the creek. "Miller was about a quarter-mile that way, both shot in the back." Xavier dismounted and examined the area. Though days had passed, he could still make out signs of what had happened: trampled grass, blood darkening the earth beneath fallen leaves. "How many men?" he asked, studying the ground. "Sheriff said 4, maybe 5, Joe answered, speaking for the first time. "Trailed them to the Blackwood boundary but couldn't go further without a warrant, and Judge Preston won't issue one without more evidence." "Judge in Blackwood's pocket," Xavier guessed. Hank spat. "Along with half the town council, Blackwood's got money and money talks." Xavier remounted. "Let's ride the boundary line. I want to see all of it." They spent the morning patrolling the northern edge of Garner land, Xavier noting where the land was most vulnerable, where natural features provided defense, where riders could approach unseen. It was good land, worth fighting for, but also difficult to defend with limited manpower. As they topped a rise overlooking a shallow valley, Xavier reined in sharply. "Hold up," he said quietly. Below, 3 riders were moving slowly along a dry creek just inside Garner territory. They weren't wearing regular cowhand clothes, but darker attire, and all had rifles prominently displayed across their saddles. "Blackwood men," Hank confirmed in a low voice. "Scouting again." Xavier studied them through narrowed eyes. "Let's pay them a visit." "Miss Meredith said to avoid confrontation if possible," Joe cautioned. "We're just going to talk," Xavier replied, nudging Comanche forward. "Stay behind me, but keep your hands near your guns." They rode down toward the 3 men, who spotted them and stopped, waiting. As they drew closer, Xavier sized them up hired guns as he'd expected, with the cold eyes of men who killed for pay. "Morning," Xavier called as they approached. "You boys seem to have strayed onto Garner land." The leader, a scar-faced man with a drooping mustache, smiled without warmth. "Just passing through. Public land, ain't it?" "No," Xavier replied evenly. "This is Garner Range. The boundary's back that way." He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "Says who?" Another of the men challenged, his hand drifting toward his holster. "Says the law and the Garner deed," Xavier answered, his own hand casually resting near his Colt. "And I'm asking politely for you to ride back to your own territory." The leader studied Xavier, noting his calm demeanor and the way he positioned himself. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "You're new," he observed. "Garner hiring drifters now?" "Just doing my job," Xavier replied. "Same as you're doing yours. Difference is I'm on the right side of the boundary line." A tense silence stretched between them. Xavier kept his breathing steady, aware that this could turn deadly in an instant. Finally, the leader chuckled. "No need to get excited. We're going." He turned his horse. "Tell Miss Garner that Mr. Blackwood sends his regards, says his offer to buy the north pasture still stands. 50 cents an acre is more than fair." "I'll pass that along," Xavier said, not moving until the 3 men had ridden well beyond the boundary line. "That was Jenkins," Hank said as they watched the men disappear over a rise. "Blackwood's new foreman. Used to ride with the younger gang before deciding regular pay was safer than outlawing." Xavier nodded, filing away the information. "Let's finish the patrol, then head back. Miss Garner should know about this." They completed their circuit without further incident and returned to the ranch by mid-afternoon. Xavier reported directly to Wilkins, who listened with a deepening frown. "You did right," the foreman said when Xavier finished, "but this ain't good. They're getting bolder, coming that far into our territory in broad daylight." He sighed. "I'll tell Miss Meredith, you get some food and rest. Tonight's your turn for night watch." Xavier nodded and headed to the cookhouse, where the cook, a bald man named Oscar with a perpetual scowl, grudgingly provided him with leftover stew and bread. As he ate, Xavier considered what he'd learned. The situation was deteriorating faster than he'd initially thought. Blackwood was making a calculated push, testing Garner defenses, seeing how far he could go. It was only a matter of time before more blood was shed. That evening, as Xavier prepared for night watch, Meredith Garner herself appeared at the bunkhouse door. The men inside immediately stood straighter, removing hats, some running nervous hands through their hair. "Mr. Cole," she called. "A word, please." Xavier followed her outside, aware of the curious glances from the other hands. Meredith led him a short distance away, out of earshot. "Sam told me about your encounter today," she said without preamble. "I appreciate your handling of it." "They were testing boundaries," Xavier replied. "Both the land's and yours." She nodded, her expression grave in the fading light. "Blackwood's been at this game since my father fell ill. First with offers to buy, then with suggestions I couldn't manage without a husband, and now with increasingly direct threats." Her jaw tightened. "I won't sell and I won't be intimidated." "It might get worse before it gets better," Xavier warned. "I'm counting on it," she replied with surprising fierceness. "Blackwood doesn't know who he's dealing with." Xavier studied her face, seeing determination but also exhaustion in the fine lines around her eyes. "How's your father?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Managing," she answered after a moment. "The doctor says he's improving, but slowly. He can speak now, though his right side remains weak. He still has his mind, thank God, and his advice." "That's something," Xavier offered. She looked at him curiously. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Cole." "What did you expect? Just another drifter looking for temporary work before moving on, but you have a soldier's eye for terrain, for tactics." She paused. "Sam says you were an officer during the war." Xavier's expression remained neutral. "That was a long time ago, not so long. And men like you don't forget what they've learned." She glanced toward the darkening horizon. "I need more than just ranch hands, Mr. Cole. I need someone who understands what we're facing." "And what exactly are we facing, Miss Garner?" "A man who wants my land and will do whatever it takes to get it, who has money, influence, and men willing to kill for him." Her eyes met his. "Can you help me keep what's mine?" The directness of her question caught Xavier off guard. He'd planned to work a few weeks, earn enough money to move on before winter set in. Getting involved in a range war hadn't been part of his calculations. "I'm just one man," he said finally. "Sometimes one man is enough to tip the balance," she replied. "I'll pay you extra $30 a month instead of 20. Xavier shook his head. "It's not about the money." "Then what is it about, Mr. Cole?" He looked past her to the ranch buildings, the grazing cattle, the men going about their evening chores. "I don't put down roots, Miss Garner. Never stay in one place too long. I'm not asking for forever," she said quietly. "Just long enough to see this through." Something in her voice made him look at her again, the quiet dignity, the unwavering resolve despite the odds against her. It reminded him of things he'd tried to forget, of causes worth fighting for. "All right," he said finally. "I'll stay until this is settled one way or another." Relief crossed her face, quickly masked. "Thank you." She straightened her shoulders. "I should let you get to your watch." "Good night, Mr. Cole." "Miss Garner," he acknowledged with a slight nod. As she walked back toward the main house, Xavier watched her go, wondering if he'd just made a decision he would come to regret. Then again, his life had been shaped by such decisions, moments when he'd chosen to act rather than walk away, for better or worse. He collected his rifle from the bunkhouse and headed to the north watchtower, a simple wooden platform built among the branches of a tall oak tree. From there, he had a clear view of the northern approach to the ranch. The night was clear, stars spreading across the vast dome of sky like scattered diamonds. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, their yips and howls carrying on the still air. Xavier settled in for the long hours ahead, his mind turning over the situation from all angles. Blackwood was making a play for Garner land, using intimidation and violence. Meredith Garner was determined to hold what was hers, despite limited resources and manpower. And Xavier himself was caught in the middle, drawn to a fight that wasn't his by a woman whose courage he couldn't help but admire. As the night deepened, Xavier's thoughts drifted to his past, to the war that had claimed his youth, to the years of wandering that followed, to the ghosts that still haunted his dreams. He'd learned long ago that a man couldn't outrun his past, but he could choose his future, one decision at a time. Tonight, he'd chosen to stand with Meredith Garner. Tomorrow would bring what it would. The night passed uneventfully, and Xavier was relieved by Charlie just before dawn. He made his way to the cookhouse for breakfast, then caught a few hours' sleep before reporting to Wilkins for the day's assignments. "Miss Meredith wants you to ride into town with her." the foreman informed him, disapproval evident in his tone. "She's got business with the bank and the sheriff." Xavier nodded, understanding the older man's concern. "I'll keep a respectful distance, Mr. Wilkins," the foreman grunted. "See that you do, and keep your eyes open. Blackwood has friends in town." Xavier went to saddle Comanche, and by the time he led the horse to the front of the main house, Meredith was already waiting. She wore a more formal riding outfit than the previous day, a deep blue skirt and jacket over a crisp white blouse, her hair neatly arranged beneath a matching hat. Despite the feminine attire, she still carried herself with the confidence of a woman accustomed to commanding respect. "Mr. Cole," she greeted him, mounting her chestnut mare with practiced ease. "Thank you for accompanying me today." "Of course," he replied, swinging into his own saddle. They rode toward town at a steady pace, the morning sun warming the air around them. After a few minutes of silence, Meredith spoke. "I should explain our errand," she said. "I'm meeting with Mr. Hollister at the bank regarding our mortgage, and then with Sheriff Burke about the rustling and the deaths of our men." Xavier glanced at her. "Mortgage troubles," she sighed. "My father took a loan 3 years ago to expand our herd after a particularly good season. We've been making the payments, but with the recent losses and Blackwood's interference, it's becoming more difficult. Mr. Hollister has been patient, but patience has limits, especially in banking." "And the sheriff, will he help?" Meredith's expression hardened. "Sheriff Burke is a decent man, but cautious. Blackwood contributes generously to his re-election fund, and without clear evidence, there's little he can do officially. So today is about showing strength," Xavier observed. "Letting the town see that Garner Ranch is still a force to be reckoned with." She looked at him with newfound appreciation. "Exactly. Appearances matter in places like Sweetwater Creek. If people think we're weakening, they'll side with whoever seems strongest." They rode into town just before noon, drawing curious glances from townsfolk going about their business. Xavier noticed how Meredith nodded and greeted people by name, her manner friendly but dignified. She was well known here, and from what he could see, generally well respected. They dismounted in front of the bank, tethering their horses to the hitching post. "This shouldn't take long," Meredith told him. "You're welcome to wait inside or remain with the horses." "I'll stay outside," Xavier replied, positioning himself where he could observe the street while keeping an eye on the bank entrance. Meredith nodded and entered the building, her back straight, her step purposeful. Xavier leaned against a post, appearing relaxed while his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings. He noted the general store across the street, the sheriff's office 2 buildings down, the saloon at the corner. Normal town activity flowed around him, a woman with a basket of groceries, children playing, men conducting business. Then he spotted them 3 men outside the saloon, watching the bank with too much interest. One was Jenkins, the scarred foreman he'd encountered the previous day. The others were clearly cut from the same cloth-hard men with guns worn low for quick drawing. Jenkins noticed Xavier's attention and raised his glass in a mocking salute. Xavier maintained his casual posture but shifted slightly, ensuring his gun hand was unobstructed. The tense standoff continued for nearly 20 minutes until Meredith emerged from the bank, her expression giving nothing away. "The horses next?" Xavier asked quietly as she approached. She glanced toward the saloon, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Jenkins and his companions. "No. The sheriff's office first." They untethered their horses and led them down the street to the sheriff's office. Xavier positioned himself to keep Jenkins in his peripheral vision, noting that the men had begun to follow at a discreet distance. Sheriff Burke was a stocky man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the harsh western sun. He greeted Meredith with formal politeness, offering her a chair in his sparsely furnished office. "Miss Garner," he acknowledged, then glanced at Xavier with open curiosity. "This is Xavier Cole," Meredith introduced. "He's recently joined our ranch hands." The sheriff nodded in greeting. "What brings you to town today, Miss Garner?" "The same matter I've brought to your attention twice before, Sheriff," she replied, her tone firm but respectful. "The rustling of our cattle and the murder of 2 of our men." Burke sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. I understand your frustration, Miss Garner. I truly do, but as I've explained, without witnesses or clear evidence pointing to specific individuals, my hands are tied by the law. And if the evidence pointed to Victor Blackwood, she pressed, would your hands still be tied? The sheriff's expression tightened. Accusations against prominent citizens require substantial proof, as you well know. 2 men are dead, Sheriff, Meredith reminded him, her voice hardening. Good men with families. Davidson had 3 children. Is their justice worth less because the man responsible contributes to your campaigns? Burke flushed. That's unfair, Miss Garner. I uphold the law equally for all citizens of this county. Then prove it, she challenged. Ride out to the Blackwood ranch, question his men about their whereabouts when my hands were killed, examine their guns. On what grounds? The sheriff asked, spreading his hands. I need evidence, not just suspicion. Xavier spoke for the first time. Sheriff, 3 of Blackwood's men are currently outside your office, watching this building. One is Jenkins, their foreman. They followed Miss Garner from the bank. Might be worth asking why they're taking such an interest in her movements. Burke frowned and moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass. That doesn't constitute evidence of murder, Mr. Cole. No, Xavier agreed, but it shows intent to intimidate. And men who intimidate often have something to hide. The sheriff studied Xavier more carefully. You're new to these parts. Where'd you ride in from? North, Xavier replied simply, and before that, here and there. Burke's eyes narrowed. You have the look of a man who's seen trouble, Mr. Cole, I hope you're not bringing any to Sweetwater Creek. I didn't bring it, Sheriff, Xavier replied evenly, but I won't ignore it either. A tense silence filled the office. Finally, Meredith rose to her feet. Thank you for your time, Sheriff Burke. I trust you'll keep your eyes open regarding this matter. The sheriff nodded, clearly relieved the conversation was ending. I always do, Miss Garner, and for what it's worth, I am sorry about Davidson and Miller. They were good men. Outside, Meredith paused before mounting her horse. That went about as I expected, she said quietly. The sheriff's afraid, Xavier observed. Not just of Blackwood's influence, but of starting a range war he can't control. Perhaps, she agreed, but his inaction only emboldens Blackwood. She glanced toward the saloon, where Jenkins and his companions still watched. We should head back to the ranch. They mounted and rode slowly down the main street, both aware of the eyes following their progress. As they passed the general store, Meredith pulled up. I need to pick up a few supplies, she said. It won't take long. Xavier nodded and dismounted with her, again positioning himself where he could watch both the store entrance and the street. Jenkins and one of his companions had moved further down the boardwalk, while the third man had disappeared. Inside the store, Meredith greeted the proprietor warmly and began selecting items: coffee, sugar, ammunition for the ranch rifles, and several yards of cloth. Xavier remained near the doorway, his back to the wall, watching the street through the window. A man entered, not one of Jenkins' companions, but someone who carried himself with authority. He was expensively dressed in a tailored suit, with a gold watch chain draped across his vest and a meticulously groomed beard. His eyes scanned the store before settling on Meredith with a predatory gleam. Miss Garner, he greeted, his voice cultured but cold. What a pleasant surprise. Meredith stiffened almost imperceptibly before turning. Mr. Blackwood, she acknowledged, her tone neutral. I didn't expect to see you in town today. Business brings me here regularly, Victor Blackwood replied, removing his hat in a mockery of gentlemanly courtesy. Just as it does you, I understand. I heard you visited the bank earlier. I do hope everything is in order with your finances. The implication hung in the air like gunsmoke. Meredith's chin lifted slightly. The Garner Ranch is doing quite well, thank you for your concern. Splendid, Blackwood smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. Though I imagine recent events have been challenging, losing cattle and men is never easy for a ranch to absorb. We manage, Meredith replied evenly. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Xavier, who had remained motionless by the door. And I see you found new help. Though I must say, Miss Garner, your father would be concerned about the quality of men you're hiring these days. Xavier said nothing, his face impassive, but his eyes never left Blackwood's face. Mr. Cole has proven himself quite capable, Meredith responded, her voice cooling further. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have purchases to complete. Blackwood didn't move. My offer still stands, you know. For the north pasture, or indeed for the entire ranch. You could return east, live comfortably among civilization again. This harsh country is no place for a woman alone. I'm not alone, Mr. Blackwood, Meredith replied. I have loyal hands, my father's guidance, and a clear title to land that has been in my family for 25 years. She gathered her purchases. Please put these on the Garner account, Mr. Simmons, she told the storekeeper, who had been watching the exchange with poorly concealed fascination. Of course, Miss Garner, the shopkeeper replied, quickly wrapping her items. Blackwood stepped closer to Meredith, lowering his voice. You're fighting a losing battle, my dear. Why not surrender gracefully? I'm a reasonable man when approached with respect. And I'm a reasonable woman when approached with honesty, she countered. But we both know honesty isn't your strong suit, Mr. Blackwood. His face darkened. Be careful, Miss Garner. Your father's reputation only protects you so far. There are many dangers for a stubborn woman in this territory. Xavier straightened from his position by the door. Miss Garner, he called quietly, the horses are getting restless. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Xavier more carefully. I know you, he said slowly. You rode with Sherman through Georgia, the ghost captain they called you. Xavier's expression remained neutral. You have me confused with someone else. I don't think so, Blackwood insisted, a new calculation entering his gaze. Your reputation preceded you even out here, a man who could appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish again. The Confederates put a price on your head. The war is over, Mr. Blackwood, Xavier replied evenly. Has been for 11 years. Some wars never end, Blackwood countered. They just change battlefields. He turned back to Meredith. Interesting company you're keeping, Miss Garner. I wonder if you know exactly what kind of man you've hired. Meredith collected her wrapped parcels from the counter. I know exactly the kind of men I hire, Mr. Blackwood, and the kind I avoid. She moved toward the door. Good day to you. Xavier held the door for her, his eyes never leaving Blackwood until they were outside. They secured the packages to their saddles in silence, both aware that Jenkins and his companions were still watching from down the street. Let's go, Meredith said quietly, mounting her horse. They rode out of town at a measured pace, neither speaking until the buildings of Sweetwater Creek had disappeared behind them. Then Meredith reined in her mare, turning to face Xavier. Is what he said true? She asked directly. Were you known as the ghost captain? Xavier met her gaze steadily. Yes, and what exactly did that entail? I led reconnaissance missions behind Confederate lines, he answered simply. Gathered intelligence, disrupted supply lines, occasionally freed prisoners. Meredith studied him. Blackwood seemed to know you personally. I never met the man before today, Xavier replied. But my unit operated in Georgia for a time. If he was there, he might have heard stories. Stories that made him look at you differently, she observed. With caution, Xavier shrugged. People hear what they want to hear. Wartime tales grow with each telling. Meredith was silent for a moment, considering. My father fought for the Confederacy, she said finally. He doesn't speak of it often, but he was at Shiloh and Chickamauga. Many good men fought on both sides, Xavier replied. Yes, she agreed. And now the war is over, as you said. She urged her horse forward again. Whatever you did then matters less to me than what you do now, Mr. Cole. They rode in companionable silence for several miles, each lost in thought. The land stretched around them, golden in the afternoon sun, beautiful despite the tensions that threaded through it. What will you do if Blackwood escalates? Xavier asked finally. Meredith's expression hardened. Whatever I must to protect what's mine, even if it means violence. I didn't start this fight, she replied, but I won't surrender simply because fighting is difficult or dangerous. Xavier nodded, respecting her resolve while worrying about its consequences. Blackwood has more men, more resources, and I have justice on my side, she countered. Plus land that my father bled for, that I've worked since I was old enough to sit a horse. She glanced at him. Do you think I should give up? No, he answered honestly, but I think you should be prepared for how ugly this might get. Her expression softened slightly. I'm not naive, Mr. Cole. I've lived in this territory my entire life. I've seen what men like Blackwood are capable of." She paused. "But I've also seen what good men can accomplish when they stand for what's right." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. Xavier felt a stirring of something he'd thought long buried, a sense of purpose, of belonging to something larger than himself. It was dangerous territory for a man who'd spent years avoiding attachments. They crested a rise, and the Garner ranch came into view below, peaceful in the afternoon light. Cattle grazed in the home pasture, smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney, and ranch hands moved about their chores. It was a scene worth protecting, Xavier had to admit. "Will you tell me someday," Meredith asked suddenly, "about Georgia and the ghost captain?" Xavier looked at her, surprised by the question. "Would you really want to hear it?" "Yes," she answered simply. "I would." Something shifted between them in that moment, a boundary crossed, a connection formed. Xavier found himself nodding. Someday, perhaps. They rode down toward the ranch, unaware that this day had set in motion events that would test them both beyond measure. The following week brought increased tension to the Garner ranch. Twice more, Blackwood's men were spotted inside their boundaries. A section of fence along the north pasture was cut, allowing several dozen cattle to wander onto Blackwood land, where they were promptly impounded as strays. When Wilkins and two hands went to retrieve them, they were met with armed resistance and forced to return empty-handed. Xavier found himself naturally assuming a leadership role among the ranch hands, organizing patrols, training the men in defensive tactics, and establishing a more rigorous watch system. Wilkins, initially resistant to the changes, gradually came to appreciate Xavier's military experience and strategic thinking. Meredith, for her part, divided her time between ranch management, caring for her father, and strategizing their response to Blackwood's provocations. Xavier often found himself summoned to the main house in the evenings to discuss the day's events and plan for various contingencies. It was during one such meeting, 10 days after their encounter with Blackwood in town, that Henry Garner insisted on joining them. Meredith helped her father into the study, where Xavier waited. Though frail and using a cane to support his weakened right side, the elder Garner's eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in Xavier's presence. "So you're Cole," he said, his speech slightly slurred but understandable. "Meredith speaks highly of your capabilities." Xavier nodded respectfully. "Mr. Garner, it's good to see you up and about. Sitting in bed while others defend my land didn't suit me," the older man replied, easing himself into a leather chair. "Meredith tells me you were a Union officer." "Yes, sir." Henry Garner studied him for a long moment. "War's over. What matters now is the present." He gestured to a chair. "Sit. Tell me your assessment of our situation." Xavier sat, choosing his words carefully. "Blackwood is testing your defenses, looking for weaknesses. The cattle he's taken, the fence cutting these are provocations designed to force you into either capitulation or rash action." "And what would you recommend?" Henry asked, leaning forward slightly. "Patience and preparation," Xavier replied. "Continue strengthening defenses, maintain vigilant patrols, but avoid direct confrontation for now. Meanwhile, gather evidence of Blackwood's illegal activities that will stand up in court." Henry nodded slowly. "And if the law continues to look the other way, then we'll need to create a situation where the law can't ignore what's happening," Xavier answered. Meredith, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "What kind of situation?" "One that forces Blackwood to show his hand publicly," Xavier explained. "Right now, he's operating in the shadows, using proxies, maintaining plausible deniability. We need to bring his actions into the light." Henry Garner's weathered face creased in a smile. "You think like I do, Cole. I like that." He turned to his daughter. "This one's worth keeping around." Meredith's cheeks colored slightly. "Father, Mr. Cole is an employee. For now," Henry replied with a knowing look that made Xavier shift uncomfortably in his chair. The meeting continued for another hour, with Henry providing insights into Blackwood's character and likely strategies based on past encounters. Despite his physical limitations, his mind remained sharp, and Xavier found himself respecting the older man's wisdom and resilience. As the discussion concluded, Henry rose laboriously to his feet, waving off Meredith's assistance. "Cole, walk with me to my room. I want a private word." Xavier exchanged a glance with Meredith, who nodded slightly, though curiosity was evident in her expression. He followed Henry Garner through the hallway to the master bedroom, matching his slow pace. Once inside, Henry closed the door and fixed Xavier with a penetrating stare. "I'm going to speak plainly, Cole, because I don't have the luxury of time for dancing around matters." "I appreciate directness, sir," Xavier replied. "Good." Henry lowered himself to the edge of his bed. "I've watched you with my daughter, and I've watched her with you." Xavier remained silent, his face carefully neutral. "She's everything to me," Henry continued. "Her mother died bringing her into this world, and I raised her alone out here, taught her everything I know about ranching, about life." His voice grew fiercer. "She's stronger than most men I've known, smarter too. But she's also alone in a world that doesn't look kindly on women who refuse to know their place. Miss Garner has earned my respect," Xavier said carefully. Henry waved this away impatiently. "Respect is the beginning, not the end. I see how you look at her when you think no one's watching. And I see how she finds reasons to seek your counsel when Wilkins has decades more experience." Xavier stiffened slightly. "Sir, I assure you—" "Oh, save it," Henry interrupted. "I'm not accusing you of impropriety, I'm telling you that I approve." This caught Xavier completely off guard. "I don't understand, don't you?" Henry challenged. "You're a man who's been running from something for years. My daughter is a woman who's been standing her ground against increasing odds. Perhaps what you both need is to meet in the middle." He leaned forward. "I won't be here much longer, Cole." This stroke was a warning. The next one might finish what it started. "You seem to be recovering well," Xavier offered. Henry snorted. "I'm not a fool. I know my limits now, and I know I need to secure Meredith's future before I go." His eyes held Xavier's. "She needs more than just a ranch hand or a hired gun. She needs a partner. Someone who sees her strength and adds to it rather than trying to diminish it." Xavier shook his head slowly. "Mr. Garner, I'm a drifter. I don't stay in one place." "Because you've never found a reason to," Henry countered. "Ask yourself this: what are you really running from? And is it worth losing something that could give your life meaning again?" The question struck deeper than Xavier wanted to admit. Before he could formulate a response, Henry continued. "I'm not asking for promises, Cole, just that you consider the possibility that what you've been searching for might be right here." He smiled tiredly. "Now help an old man to bed before my daughter comes looking for us." Xavier assisted Henry into bed, his mind tumbling with thoughts he'd been carefully avoiding. As he turned to leave, Henry spoke once more. "One last thing, Cole. If Blackwood makes a move against Meredith directly, you have my blessing to respond with whatever force is necessary. Some things are worth killing for, some things are worth dying for. This land and my daughter's right to it are both." Xavier nodded solemnly. "I understand, sir." "I believe you do," Henry replied. "Now go find my daughter and tell her I'm resting comfortably. She worries too much." Xavier left the room, his composure intact but his thoughts in turmoil. In the hallway, he nearly collided with Meredith, who was indeed coming to check on them. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "Father didn't tire himself out." "He's resting now," Xavier assured her. "He wanted to discuss some private concerns." Meredith studied him curiously. "You look troubled." "Just thinking about our next steps," he deflected. "Your father is a remarkable man." "Yes," she agreed, a shadow crossing her face. "Though not as strong as he pretends to be." They stood in the hallway, closer than propriety might dictate, neither moving away. Xavier was acutely aware of her presence, the faint scent of lavender, the way lamplight caught in her auburn hair, the strength and vulnerability mingled in her expression. "I should get back to the bunkhouse," he said finally. "Dawn comes early." "Of course." She stepped back slightly. "Thank you for your counsel tonight, Xavier." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice stirred something deep within him. "Good night, Meredith," he replied, the formality between them falling away for that brief moment. As he walked back to the bunkhouse through the cool night air, Xavier confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He was developing feelings for Meredith Garner that went far beyond professional respect or physical attraction. And judging by Henry Garner's words, those feelings might not be entirely one-sided. The realization both exhilarated and terrified him. After years of careful detachment, of never staying long enough to form lasting connections, he found himself contemplating a different path. It was dangerous territory for a man with his past. In the bunkhouse, the other hands were already asleep or pretending to be. Xavier lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying Henry Garner's words. What are you really running from? And is it worth losing something that could give your life meaning again? The answer had seemed clear for so many years. He was running from the ghosts of war, from the men he'd killed and the comrades he'd lost, from the memories that haunted his dreams. But now, with Meredith Garner's image in his mind, the certainty of that answer began to waver. Morning brought no clarity, only the immediate demands of the day. Xavier rose before dawn, joining the other hands for a quick breakfast before heading out to check the north boundary. He rode with Pete and Charlie, the three of them alert for any sign of Blackwood's men. They were halfway through their patrol when they spotted fresh tracks, at least 6 horses, heading into Garner territory. Careful, Xavier cautioned, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. These aren't ordinary ranch movements. They followed the tracks cautiously, keeping to cover where possible. After about 2 miles, they heard voices ahead and dismounted, tethering their horses in a stand of cottonwoods before proceeding on foot. In a small clearing by the creek, they found 4 of Blackwood's men, including Jenkins, confronting 2 Garner hands, young Miguel and veteran ranch hand Frank. The Blackwood men had their guns drawn, while Miguel and Frank stood with their hands raised. Last chance, Jenkins was saying. Tell us where Garner's moving the main herd and you can ride away. Go to hell, Frank spat. We ain't telling you nothing. Jenkins sighed theatrically. Always the hard way. He nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward and slammed his pistol butt into Frank's temple. The older man crumpled to the ground as Miguel lunged forward in protest, only to be restrained by the other men. Xavier signaled to Pete and Charlie, who spread out to flank the clearing. When they were in position, Xavier stepped from cover, his rifle aimed squarely at Jenkins. That's enough, he called, his voice carrying clearly. Drop your weapons. The Blackwood men whirled, reaching for their guns, but froze when they saw 3 rifles trained on them from different directions. You're outnumbered and outpositioned, Xavier continued calmly. Make the smart choice. Jenkins's eyes narrowed as he recognized Xavier. Cole, he spat. Should have known you'd be skulking about. Guns on the ground, Xavier repeated. Now. After a tense moment, Jenkins nodded slightly to his men, who slowly placed their weapons on the ground. Charlie moved forward to collect them while Pete kept his rifle trained on the group. Xavier approached Jenkins. You're trespassing on Garner land and assaulting Garner men. That's enough to hang you. We were just having a friendly conversation, Jenkins smirked. Ain't that right, boys? Didn't look friendly to me, Xavier replied, glancing at Frank, who was starting to regain consciousness, blood trickling from the wound on his temple. Miguel, see to Frank. Can he ride? Miguel knelt beside the older man. I think so, Mr. Cole. Xavier turned back to Jenkins. Here's what's going to happen. You and your men are going to mount up and ride straight back to Blackwood land, and you're going to deliver a message to your employer. What message? Jenkins asked, his tone mocking. Tell him that the next Blackwood man found on Garner property will be returned in a pine box, Xavier said evenly. This is your only warning. Jenkins's face darkened. You're making a mistake, Cole. Blackwood doesn't take kindly to threats. Neither do I, Xavier replied. Now mount up. Under the unwavering aim of the Garner rifles, Jenkins and his men retrieved their horses and mounted. Xavier returned their guns emptied of ammunition as they prepared to leave. One more thing, Xavier added as Jenkins turned his horse. If Frank's injury proves serious, I'll hold you personally responsible. Jenkins spat on the ground. You're a dead man walking, Cole. You just don't know it yet. With that, he spurred his horse and rode off, his men following. Once they were out of sight, Xavier helped Miguel get Frank onto his horse. The older man was dazed but conscious, insisting he could ride. What were you two doing out here alone? Xavier asked as they mounted up. Checking water levels in the creek, Frank answered, pressing a bandana to his bleeding temple. Didn't expect trouble in broad daylight. From now on, no one rides alone, Xavier instructed. Minimum groups of 3, everyone armed. He looked at Charlie and Pete. Let's get Frank back to the ranch and report this to Miss Garner. They rode back at a measured pace, mindful of Frank's condition. At the ranch, Meredith was overseeing repairs to a corral when they arrived. Her face paled at the sight of Frank's bloodied head. What happened? She demanded, hurrying forward as they dismounted. Xavier explained while Pete helped Frank to the cookhouse, where Oscar kept medical supplies for minor injuries. Meredith's expression hardened as she listened. This has gone far enough, she said when Xavier finished. Blackwood's men attacking our hands on our own land in daylight crosses every line. I agree, Xavier replied. Which is why I told Jenkins the next Blackwood man found trespassing wouldn't leave alive. Meredith's eyes widened slightly. That's a serious escalation, Xavier. It's what they understand, he said simply, and it might make them think twice before trying again. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded slowly. Perhaps you're right, but this will provoke a response from Blackwood. I'm counting on it, Xavier replied, but on our terms, not his. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Joe, riding hard from the direction of town. He reined in sharply, dust billowing around his horse. Miss Meredith, he called, dismounting quickly, just came from town. Blackwood's filed a legal claim against the ranch, saying the north pasture rightfully belongs to him based on some old survey markers. Meredith's face tightened. When is the hearing? 3 days from now, Joe answered. Judge Preston will preside. The same judge who's in Blackwood's pocket, Xavier observed. Exactly, Meredith agreed grimly. This is his play use the law to take what he wants, with a judge already predisposed to rule in his favor. Xavier considered this new development. We need to prepare a strong legal case, but also be ready if Blackwood tries something less legal in the meantime. Meredith nodded, her mind clearly working through options. I'll go through my father's papers. He kept detailed records of the original land purchase and boundaries. She glanced at Xavier. Double the patrols tonight. I don't trust Blackwood not to try something while we're distracted by this legal challenge. Already planned to, Xavier assured her. That evening, after organizing the night patrols, Xavier was again summoned to the main house. He found Meredith in her father's study, surrounded by stacks of yellowed documents, her hair falling loose from its usual neat arrangement after hours of searching. Any luck? He asked from the doorway. She looked up, fatigue evident in her face. Yes and no. I found the original deed and survey maps, which clearly show the north pasture as part of our property. But I also found correspondence suggesting there was a dispute about those boundaries 20 years ago, before Blackwood even arrived in the territory. Xavier entered the room, examining the map she indicated. Who was the dispute with? A man named Harrington who owned the land before Blackwood, she explained. Father settled it by purchasing an additional 500 acres as a buffer zone. She pointed to another document. But Blackwood could argue that the settlement acknowledged an error in the original survey. Xavier frowned. It's a weak argument, but with a sympathetic judge. Exactly, Meredith sighed, rubbing her temples. Sometimes I think Blackwood is right about one thing: the law out here is still too easily bent by money and influence. Then we need to find leverage that even Judge Preston can't ignore, Xavier suggested, sitting across from her. Such as evidence that Blackwood is behind the rustling and murders, Xavier replied. If we could prove that, his land claim would be seen for what it is: another tactic in a campaign of intimidation. Meredith considered this. How would we get such evidence? His men won't talk, and the sheriff won't investigate. Perhaps we need to create a situation where they reveal themselves, Xavier said slowly, an idea forming. What if Blackwood believed you were moving the main herd to the south pasture, away from the disputed boundary? He'd see it as a sign of weakness, a retreat, Meredith realized, leaning forward. He might get overconfident. Exactly, Xavier nodded. We leak information about moving the herd, but actually set up a carefully planned trap. If Blackwood's men take the bait and try to rustle cattle or cause trouble, We'd have witnesses to their actions, Meredith finished, her eyes brightening. Multiple witnesses, including perhaps the sheriff himself, if we could get him there at the right time. It's risky, Xavier cautioned. If Blackwood suspects a trap, he might send more men than we can handle. Everything about this situation is risky, Meredith replied, but I like this plan better than waiting for a corrupt judge to rule against us. She studied him across the desk. You've done this before, haven't you? Set traps for enemies during the war. Xavier nodded slightly. Similar situations require similar tactics. Meredith rose and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. My father always said that land is only worth what you're willing to do to keep it. She turned back to Xavier. I'm willing to risk everything for this ranch, not just because it's my inheritance, but because it represents everything my parents sacrificed for, everything I've worked for. Xavier stood as well, drawn to her intensity. I understand, do you? She asked softly. You've spent years avoiding attachments, never staying long enough to put down roots. What would you risk everything for, Xavier? The question hung between them, charged with meaning beyond the immediate crisis they faced. Xavier found himself moving closer to her, drawn by something he couldn't name. There was a time when I would have said nothing, he admitted. After the war, I didn't believe anything was worth that kind of commitment again. And now, her voice was barely above a whisper. Xavier reached out, his fingers lightly touching her cheek. Now I'm beginning to remember what it feels like to have something worth fighting for. The moment stretched between them, fragile and potent. Meredith's eyes searched his, finding whatever reassurance she sought. She leaned slightly into his touch, her expression softening. Xavier, she began, but was interrupted by a knock at the study door. They stepped apart quickly as Wilkins entered, his weathered face grave. Sorry to interrupt, Miss Meredith, but we've got trouble. Riders approaching from the north, at least a dozen, moving fast. The intimate moment shattered, replaced by immediate concern. Xavier moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. How far? Maybe 10 minutes out, Wilkins answered. Joe spotted them from the north watchtower. Meredith was already moving, her voice calm but commanding. Sound the alarm, get every hand armed and in position, and have someone help my father to the cellar. It's the safest place if there's shooting. Wilkins nodded and hurried out. Xavier turned to Meredith. Stay in the house. If this turns ugly, I won't hide while others defend my home, she interrupted firmly. I can shoot as well as any man on this ranch. Xavier recognized the determination in her eyes and nodded. Then we'd better get ready. They moved quickly, Xavier retrieving his rifle and extra ammunition from his saddle bags while Meredith collected a shotgun from a cabinet in the hallway. Outside, ranch hands were taking defensive positions around the buildings, their faces tense but resolute. Xavier found Wilkins directing men to the barn roof. How many guns can we muster? He asked the foreman. 15 counting you and Miss Meredith, Wilkins replied. Every hand is here tonight by luck. Or providence, Xavier muttered. He quickly assessed their defensive position. The ranch buildings formed a rough square, with the main house on one side, bunkhouse and cookhouse on another, and barn and stables forming the remaining sides. The central courtyard offered little cover for attackers. Put 2 men on each corner of the barn roof, Xavier instructed. 2 more on the bunkhouse. The rest spread between the buildings, using doorways and windows for cover. He turned to Meredith, who had joined them. If they're coming to talk, I'll meet them in the open. If they're coming for blood, they'll have to pay dearly for it. She nodded, her face pale but determined in the lamplight. Be careful. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Then they heard the distant thunder of approaching horses, growing louder with each passing second. Xavier positioned himself at the front of the main house, rifle ready but not raised, projecting calm confidence despite the tension coiling within him. The riders appeared as dark silhouettes against the night sky, slowing as they approached the ranch yard. As they drew closer, Xavier counted 14 men with Victor Blackwood himself at their head. They halted just beyond the ranch buildings, spreading out in a semicircle. Garner, Blackwood called out, show yourself. Xavier remained where he was, aware that every Garner rifle was trained on the intruders. After a moment, Meredith stepped forward to stand beside him, shotgun held casually but ready. "This is my property, Mr. Blackwood," she called back, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "State your business or leave." Blackwood urged his horse a few steps closer. "My business is simple. Jenkins tells me your new foreman threatened to kill any of my men found on what you claim is Garner land." "That's correct," Xavier replied evenly. "After your men assaulted 2 of our hands today." "A misunderstanding," Blackwood dismissed with a wave of his hand. "But threats of murder are another matter entirely. I've come to make myself clear I won't have my men intimidated while going about their lawful business." "There's nothing lawful about trespassing, rustling, or assault," Meredith countered. "You've pushed this too far, Blackwood." "Have I?" Blackwood's voice took on a dangerous edge. "The law will determine whose land this is in 3 days' time. Judge Preston is quite interested in the evidence I've presented regarding the original survey errors." "We'll see you in court then," Meredith replied firmly. "Until then, stay off my land." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "You're making a grave mistake, Miss Garner. A woman alone can't hope to hold this ranch against determined opposition." "She's not alone," Xavier stated, stepping slightly forward. The ranch hands shifted around the perimeter, making their presence and readiness obvious. Blackwood studied the defensive arrangement, clearly reassessing the situation. After a long moment, he smiled coldly. "Very well. We'll let the law decide this matter. But know this, Miss Garner, one way or another, the north pasture will be mine, and eventually this entire ranch." "Not while I draw breath," Meredith replied steadily. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Xavier. "That condition can be altered, my dear." He raised his hand, signaling his men. 3 days, Miss Garner, then we'll see who has the stronger claim." With that, he wheeled his horse around, his men following as they rode back into the darkness. The tension in the ranch yard eased slightly as the sound of hoofbeats faded, but no one relaxed completely. Xavier turned to the assembled hands. "Double watches tonight," he ordered. "They might have been testing our defenses, planning to return when they think we've let our guard down." The men nodded, moving to their assigned positions with grim determination. Meredith stood silent for a moment, watching them go. "He won't wait for the court hearing," she said quietly to Xavier. "This visit was to gauge our strength and resolve." "I agree," Xavier replied, "which means we need to implement our trap sooner rather than later." "Tomorrow," Meredith decided. "We'll start spreading word that we're moving the herd south, away from the disputed boundary." She looked up at Xavier, her face set with determination. "And we'll be ready when they come." They spent the next day preparing. Wilkins and 3 trusted hands were sent to town separately, each tasked with mentioning in the right places the saloon, the general store, the blacksmith shop that the Garner Ranch was moving its main herd to the south pasture the following day, to avoid further trouble with Blackwood. Meanwhile, Xavier, Meredith, and the remaining hands prepared the trap. A small herd of 50 cattle would indeed be moved, but with armed men concealed in the surrounding brush and rocks. Xavier carefully selected positions that offered cover and clear lines of fire while remaining hidden from casual observation. "The key is to let them commit fully to the attack before we reveal ourselves," he explained to the assembled hands that evening. "We need witnesses to their actions, clear evidence that they're the aggressors." "What about the sheriff?" Charlie asked. "Shouldn't he be there to see it?" "I sent a note to Sheriff Burke," Meredith replied, "informing him that we've had threats against our herd and requesting his presence tomorrow as a precaution. Whether he comes or not will tell us something about where his true loyalties lie." The men nodded, their faces serious. They understood the stakes, not just the land itself, but their livelihoods and possibly their lives. As the meeting concluded, Xavier pulled Wilkins aside. "If things go wrong tomorrow, your priority is getting Miss Garner to safety." The foreman studied him for a moment. "And your priority?" "Making sure you have that chance," Xavier replied evenly. Wilkins nodded slowly, a new respect in his eyes. "You care for her." It wasn't a question, but Xavier answered anyway. "Yes." "Good," the older man said simply. "She deserves someone who'll stand beside her, not in front of her." He clasped Xavier's shoulder briefly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will come early enough. Morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of heat later in the day. The ranch was busy with purposeful activity as the small herd was gathered and preparations finalized. Meredith rode among the men, offering encouragement and last-minute instructions, her confidence bolstering their resolve. Xavier found her checking her rifle near the corral. "Everything's set," he informed her. "The men know their positions, we're as ready as we can be." She nodded, her expression determined. "Any word on whether the sheriff will show?" Joe just returned from town, said Burke was non-committal but seemed interested. Xavier frowned slightly. "I'm not counting on him." "Neither am I," Meredith agreed, "but his presence would make our case stronger." The small herd began moving out just after 9, guided by 4 hands riding openly while the others took concealed positions along the route. Xavier rode with Meredith, both of them staying back, watching for any sign of Blackwood's men. They had traveled about 5 miles, approaching a narrow valley that offered perfect ambush terrain when Xavier spotted dust on the horizon. "Riders coming," he said quietly. "At least 10, moving fast on an intercept course." Meredith nodded, her face calm despite the danger. Just as we expected. They signaled to the drovers, who continued moving the herd forward as planned, while Xavier and Meredith took cover behind a rocky outcropping that gave them a clear view of the approaching riders. "Blackwood's men," Xavier confirmed as the riders drew closer. "Jenkins in the lead, and that's Blackwood himself just behind him." Meredith's eyes narrowed. "I didn't expect him to come personally. He usually keeps his hands clean." "He's confident," Xavier observed. "Too confident." They watched as Blackwood's men surrounded the small herd and the 4 drovers, who raised their hands in apparent surrender. Jenkins could be heard shouting orders, directing some men to gather the cattle while others kept the Garner hands covered. "Hold," Xavier cautioned as Meredith tensed beside him. "Let them commit fully." The moment came when Blackwood himself rode forward, saying something to the drovers that made one lunge forward angrily, only to be struck down by the butt of Jenkins' rifle. That was when Xavier gave the signal, a single shot fired into the air. Instantly, the hidden Garner hands emerged from cover, rifles aimed at Blackwood's men. Xavier and Meredith moved out as well, catching the rustlers in a perfect crossfire. "Drop your weapons," Xavier called out. "You're surrounded." Confusion erupted among Blackwood's men as they realized they'd ridden into a trap. Some reached for their guns, others looked to Blackwood for direction. Jenkins was the first to recover, swinging his rifle toward the nearest Garner hand. The shot that rang out came not from any of the ranch hands, but from somewhere beyond the confrontation. Jenkins jerked in his saddle, a look of surprise crossing his face before he toppled to the ground. A second shot followed immediately, kicking up dust at Blackwood's horse's feet. "Next one's for you, Blackwood," called a familiar voice. Sheriff Burke emerged from behind a stand of trees, rifle in hand, 2 deputies flanking him. "Tell your men to drop their weapons, or so help me, I'll drop you where you sit." Blackwood's face contorted with fury and disbelief. "Burke. What the hell do you think you're doing?" "My job," the sheriff replied coldly. "Now order your men to disarm, or you'll be the next one bleeding in the dirt." The standoff lasted only moments before Blackwood, seeing no alternative, raised his hands. "Do as he says," he ordered his men, his voice tight with suppressed rage. One by one, Blackwood's men dropped their weapons and dismounted under the watchful eyes of the Garner hands and the sheriff's deputies. Burke approached Jenkins, who lay motionless on the ground. "Dead," he announced after a brief examination. "Can't say I'm sorry about that. He was wanted in 3 territories." Blackwood remained on his horse, his eyes burning with hatred as they fixed on Meredith and Xavier. "This changes nothing," he spat. "The court will still rule in my favor." "I wouldn't count on that," Burke replied, producing a folded paper from his vest pocket. "This here's a telegram from the territorial governor, responding to some information I sent him yesterday about your activities, Blackwood. Seems he's quite interested in reports of rustling, murder, and attempted land theft. So interested, in fact, that he's appointed a special prosecutor to review all land claims in this county." Blackwood's face paled slightly. "You can't do this, Burke. We had an understanding." "We did," the sheriff agreed. Until I found out you ordered the killing of 2 good men who never harmed anyone, there are some lines even I won't cross for campaign donations." He gestured to his deputies. "Take them all in. Charges are rustling, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder." As the deputies began securing the prisoners, Meredith approached the sheriff. "Thank you," she said simply. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Burke looked uncomfortable. "I should have done this weeks ago, Miss Garner. Your father and I go back a long way, and I let myself forget that when Blackwood started spreading his money around." He glanced at Jenkins' body. "Some stains don't wash off so easy." "What changed your mind?" Xavier asked, joining them. The sheriff's eyes shifted to him. "Partly what Joe said yesterday about cattle being moved to avoid trouble made me realize how far things had gone when law-abiding folks were changing their ways to accommodate criminals." He paused. "And partly a visit I had last night from Henry Garner himself. My father came to town." Meredith asked, shocked. Burke nodded. "Drove himself in that old buggy, weak as he is. Said he needed to look me in the eye one last time and ask if I was still the man he'd once trusted with his life at Chickamauga. Said some choices define a man forever." The sheriff looked away, embarrassed by the emotion in his voice. He was right. The cleanup took hours. Jenkins' body was loaded onto a wagon, and Blackwood and his men were escorted to town under guard. The stolen cattle were returned to the main herd, and the injured drover, fortunately only dazed by the blow, was patched up by Charlie, who had some medical experience. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Xavier found Meredith sitting on a rocky outcropping overlooking the valley, her expression contemplative. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, sitting beside her. She smiled faintly. "They're probably not worth that much. I'm just processing everything that's happened." "It's been quite a day," Xavier agreed. Blackwood's facing serious charges, the governor's involved, and the sheriff remembered which side of the law he's supposed to be on. "And my father somehow managed to drive himself to town without telling anyone," Meredith added, a mix of exasperation and admiration in her voice. "He could have had another stroke or worse." "He's a determined man," Xavier observed, "like his daughter." She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "What happens now, Xavier?" The question held layers of meaning, and Xavier knew she wasn't just asking about Blackwood or the ranch. "That depends," he replied carefully. "On what?" "On whether a drifter who's spent years running from his past can find the courage to stop running and face his future." Meredith's expression softened. "And can he?" Xavier reached out, taking her hand in his. "With the right reason, I think he can." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Meredith leaned forward, closing the distance, her lips meeting his in a kiss that spoke of promise and belonging. Xavier's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer as something long dormant within him awakened fully. When they finally parted, Meredith's eyes were bright with emotion. "Is that reason enough?" she asked softly. Xavier smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. "More than enough," he assured her. "Though your father might have some opinions on the matter." Meredith laughed. "Oh, I think he's made his opinions quite clear already, driving to town in his condition to make sure the sheriff did the right thing." She sobered slightly. "He likes you, you know. Says you remind him of himself when he was younger." "High praise," Xavier replied, "though I'm not sure I deserve it." "You do," she insisted. "You came here with nothing, Xavier, no connections, no possessions beyond what you could carry. And yet you chose to stand with us, to fight for something that wasn't yours." "Maybe I was fighting for something that could be mine," he suggested, his hand still holding hers. "A future I never thought I'd have." The sun was setting now, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. In the valley below, the last of the Garner hands were preparing to return to the ranch, the day's victory evident in their relaxed postures and occasional laughter. "We should head back," Meredith said, though she made no move to rise. "Father will be worried." "In a minute," Xavier replied, reluctant to break the moment. "I want to remember this, the light, the land, you." She smiled, leaning against him as they watched the sun sink below the horizon. "You know, when a cowboy rode into Sweetwater Creek 3 weeks ago, I never imagined he'd change everything." "Is that what I've done?" Xavier asked, genuinely curious. You've reminded me that this land is worth fighting for, she answered, and that I don't have to fight alone. As darkness settled around them, they finally rose and made their way back to their horses. The ride to the ranch was peaceful, the tension of recent weeks replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. The future still held challenges: Blackwood's trial, rebuilding the ranch's security, Henry Garner's health, but for the first time, those challenges didn't seem insurmountable. The ranch was quiet when they arrived, most hands already settled in the bunkhouse after the long day. Light glowed in the windows of the main house, where Henry Garner undoubtedly waited for news of the day's events. Xavier helped Meredith dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "I should see to Comanche," he said reluctantly. "And I should report to Father," she replied, equally reluctant to part. "But perhaps, after," Xavier nodded, understanding her meaning. "I'll be on the porch swing. Take your time with your father. He deserves to hear everything." Meredith touched his cheek gently. "Thank you, Xavier." "For everything." He watched her walk to the house, her silhouette framed briefly in the doorway before she disappeared inside. Then he led both horses to the stable, taking extra care with their grooming, his mind full of possibilities he'd long since stopped considering. By the time he settled on the porch swing, the ranch was fully dark, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the chirping of crickets. Stars spread across the velvet sky in countless patterns, the same stars he'd followed across thousands of miles of wandering. The door opened, and Meredith emerged, now wearing a simple dress rather than her riding clothes, her hair loose around her shoulders. "How's your father?" Xavier asked as she joined him on the swing. Pleased with the outcome, though the doctor scolded him severely for his unauthorized trip to town, she replied, settling beside him. "He wants to see you tomorrow, says he has a proposition for you." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "What kind of proposition?" "He wouldn't say exactly, but it involves the ranch's future management." She studied his reaction. "You don't have to accept whatever it is." "I know," Xavier assured her, "but I'll listen with an open mind." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the swing moving gently beneath them. Xavier's arm rested along the back, not quite embracing her but close enough to feel her warmth. "Tell me about Georgia," Meredith said suddenly. "About the ghost captain. You promised someday you would." Xavier was quiet for so long that Meredith thought he might not answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured, sharing pieces of himself he'd kept hidden for years. The young lieutenant thrust into command after his captain's death, the desperate missions behind enemy lines, the men lost under his leadership, the burden of decisions that meant life or death. Meredith listened without interruption, her hand finding his as the painful memories flowed. When he finally fell silent, she squeezed his fingers gently. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "I've never told anyone the full story before," Xavier admitted. "It felt right to share it with you, because you trust me, because you understand what it means to carry responsibility for others," he replied. "To make hard choices for something you believe in." She nodded, accepting this. "Is that why you've been drifting all these years?" "Because of what happened in Georgia, partly," Xavier acknowledged. "After seeing so much death, so much loss, I didn't want to risk carrying that deeply again. It seemed safer to keep moving, to avoid forming connections that could be broken." "And now?" Meredith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier turned to face her fully, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Now I'm starting to think that some connections are worth the risk, that a life without them isn't really living at all." Meredith's eyes shimmered in the starlight. "I think my mother would have said something similar. My father told me once that she knew ranching in this territory would be dangerous, difficult, possibly even fatal. But she chose it anyway because to her, a safe life without love and purpose wasn't enough." "She sounds like a wise woman," Xavier said. "I think she would have liked you," Meredith replied with a small smile. "Father says I have her spirit and her stubbornness." "Both admirable qualities," Xavier assured her, returning her smile, "especially in a rancher." "And in a partner?" she asked, the question hanging between them. Xavier's hand rose to cup her cheek. "Especially in a partner." This time when their lips met, it was with a deeper understanding, a shared acknowledgement of all that had been said and all that remained to be explored. The kiss spoke of new beginnings, of healing, of a future neither had dared imagine just weeks before. When they finally parted, Meredith rested her head against Xavier's shoulder, her body fitting perfectly against his side as they gazed up at the star-filled sky. No words were needed in that moment, just the simple joy of being together, of finding in each other something long sought but never expected. The next morning, Xavier met with Henry Garner as requested. The older man was seated in his study, looking tired but satisfied with the previous day's outcome. "Cole," he greeted, gesturing to a chair. "Sit down, we have matters to discuss." Xavier took the offered seat. "Mr. Garner." "I understand congratulations might be in order," Henry said, a knowing gleam in his eye. "My daughter seemed unusually happy at breakfast this morning." Xavier felt heat rise in his face but met the older man's gaze directly. "I care deeply for Meredith, sir." "If you're asking my intentions," Henry waved away his words. "Your intentions are written all over your face, son, and I approve as I've already told you." He leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "What I want to discuss is the future of this ranch." "I'm listening," Xavier replied. "This place needs a strong hand to guide it," Henry continued. "Meredith has the knowledge and the heart for it, but running a spread this size isn't a one-person job. It never has been. Even in my prime, I relied on good men to help me." Xavier nodded, beginning to understand where this was heading. "Wilkins is a fine foreman, but he's getting on in years, same as me. He mentioned retiring within the year." Henry's gaze was steady. "I'm offering you a position as ranch manager, Cole. Working alongside Meredith, helping to build something that could last generations." The offer hung in the air between them. Xavier considered it carefully, aware of its significance, not just employment, but a commitment to the land, to the Garner legacy, and most importantly, to Meredith herself. "It's a generous offer," he said finally, "but I want to be clear about something, sir. My feelings for your daughter aren't contingent on any position here. If she'll have me, I'd stay regardless of title or responsibility." Henry smiled, satisfaction evident in his expression. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." He reached for a small box on his desk and pushed it across to Xavier. This was her mother's. Meredith's mother wore it for 15 years before God took her home. I think she'd approve of it finding its way to your pocket until the right moment arrives. Xavier opened the box to find a simple gold ring with a small diamond, elegant in its understated beauty. "Mr. Garner, Henry," the older man corrected. "If you're going to be family, you might as well use my name." "Henry," Xavier amended, deeply moved by the gesture. "Thank you. I'll treasure this and the trust it represents." "Just make her happy," Henry replied simply. "That's all a father can ask." The trial of Victor Blackwood and his men took place 2 months later in the territorial capital, far from his sphere of influence in Sweetwater Creek. With testimony from Sheriff Burke, the surviving Garner hands, and documented evidence of falsified land claims, the outcome was never really in doubt. Blackwood received 20 years in territorial prison, his empire dismantled, his land sold at auction to satisfy the claims of those he had wronged. The Garner ranch recovered slowly but steadily. The stolen cattle were returned, fences rebuilt, and under the joint management of Meredith and Xavier, innovations were introduced that improved productivity and worker conditions alike. Henry Garner watched it all with quiet pride, his health stabilizing enough to allow him to sit on the porch most days, offering advice when asked, but trusting his daughter and her chosen partner to chart the ranch's future. Xavier proposed formally at Christmas, though it surprised no one on the ranch. The simple gold ring that had once belonged to Meredith's mother fit perfectly, a symbol of continuity and new beginnings intertwined. They were married in the spring, with Henry proudly walking his daughter down the aisle of the small Sweetwater Creek church, Sheriff Burke serving as best man, and the entire ranch staff in attendance. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and responsibilities, of challenges met together and quiet moments cherished. Xavier found in Meredith a partner who matched his strength and healed his wounds, while she discovered in him a steadfastness that complemented her passionate nature. Together, they built something neither could have created alone, not just a successful ranch, but a home filled with purpose and love. 5 years after Xavier Cole rode into Sweetwater Creek with nothing but his horse and a handful of bullets, he stood on the porch of the Garner Ranch, now the Garner Cole Ranch, by Henry's insistence before his peaceful passing the previous winter. Beside him, Meredith cradled their infant daughter, named Elizabeth after her grandmother, while their 3-year-old son Henry chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Penny for your thoughts," Meredith said, echoing words spoken years before on a rocky outcropping as the sun set on a day of victory. Xavier smiled, wrapping an arm around his wife's shoulders. "I was just thinking about journeys," he replied. "How the one that brought me here started long before I knew where I was going. Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The freedom of the open road, answering to no one." Xavier looked at his family, at the son with his mother's determination, and his father's watchful eyes, at the daughter whose future stretched before her, unbounded by the limitations previous generations of women had faced, at the wife whose courage and love had given him a home when he'd stopped believing such things were possible. "Not for a moment," he answered truthfully. "I spent years searching for something I couldn't name. Turns out I was looking for this all along, a place to belong, people to love who love me in return." Meredith leaned against him, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. "Who would have thought," she mused, "that a cowboy riding into town with nothing would find everything he never knew he wanted?" "And ride out again with a woman on his horse," Xavier added, remembering that day long ago when they'd first left town together, strangers on the verge of a journey neither could have anticipated. "The best kind of journey," Meredith agreed, tilting her face up for his kiss as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the same stars that had guided him across countless miles to the place and the people he now called home.